Hi, I'm Jay McClellan, and my wife and I just completed a 1,000-mile road trip in our new Thor Sanctuary 19P camper van, and I want to show you how it went. I've got a lot of dash cam footage of driving down some interesting trails. Nothing really highly technically challenging, but it was a challenge to fit the van through some of the narrower spaces that were more overgrown, and a challenge to get through some of the mud spots, so that was a lot of fun, and I'll show you that. I also want to show you how well some of my improvements worked out. I just published a video on a bunch of improvements that I made to the van before we did this trip, and I'll show you how some of those worked. And I'll also show you some things I now need to repair that broke along the way. Not too many, but a couple. And also show you some ideas I have for some future enhancement based on what we learned during this week-long trip. So let's get started. We live in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, so to reach the Upper Peninsula, or the UP, we drove across the Mackinac Bridge. And the deck of the bridge is about 200 feet above the water of the Straits of Mackinac, so it can get pretty windy up there. But this day was fairly calm, and so we didn't have any stiff crosswinds and didn't really test the suspension of the van on this part of the trip. We spent the first night at the Straits State Park, which has this nice view of the Mackinac Bridge, before we met up with friends the next morning. The next morning, our first task was to shuttle our friends and their backpacks to a trailhead on the North Country Trail, so the van's back bench seat came in handy for carrying extra passengers, and we just carried their gear on the floor. These were well-maintained gravel roads, but they were still a bit rough in some spots. Once we got to the trailhead, we stopped for some brief introductions.
Bill Canarian, out Otsego, Michigan now, and first time in the UP on the Upper on this trail.
Jim Simmons, Grand Haven, Michigan. Damn glad to be on this trail with these two men.
Jason Parsons, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Glad to be with these guys. It'll be an adventure, to say the least.
Yeah.
All right, well, happy trails.
All right, good.
Thank you.
We'll see you later.
This evening, this afternoon sometime.
All righty. Once our hikers were safely on their way, we aired down the tires before we set out to explore the surrounding area with our friend Tom in his Jeep. Our normal tire pressure on the van is 46 psi in the front and 70 in the back, and I dropped them down about 28% to 33 pounds in the front and 50 in the back. So that's kind of a modest airing down. It doesn't really change the handling of the van and probably didn't have much of effect on our traction, but it definitely softened the ride on these bumpy gravel roads. Full of frogs, too. We eventually reached some smaller roads that had some muddy sections, and since it was my first time taking the van off the road like this, I started out being pretty conservative, and I ended up going through a mud patch too slowly, where I didn't really have enough momentum to carry us all the way through. We got stuck here, but not real bad, and I probably could have gotten it out on its own, but rather than taking a chance on digging it down deeper, I stopped and got out the Max-Trax recovery boards. I didn't get a video of driving out on the Max-Trax, but Tom snapped this quick picture just as we were getting out. There we go.
Looking good. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. All right.
From this point on, I made sure to keep up more speed as we went through the muddy spots. We did find some obstructions that wouldn't have been the problem for shorter vehicles, but was a problem for our 10-foot tall van. And we had a chainsaw with us, but for the simpler ones like this one, the bow saw was just as easy. For the smaller branches across the trail, we just pushed our way through them, and that worked fine. Yeah, I figured we'd have pinstripes by the time we're done.
Hi.
Might just be our backing up point.
Yeah.
We'll take a look though. Eventually we came to this fallen tree blocking the trail, and a Jeep or shorter vehicle could probably get under it and around it, but it was too low for us. So we had a chainsaw with us, and we had a Jeep with a winch, so we certainly could have removed this tree, but it would have been a fair amount of work and possibly some risk. So we decided it just wasn't worth the time at this spot, and decided to turn back and find an alternate route through this section. Eventually we met up with our hikers at this nice campsite along the North Country Trail right on the shore of a lake. We camped nearby before heading out the next morning to explore some more trails. Hi, here we are riding down the trail. Having lots of fun. In a van. Okay, you probably don't want to see that. There's the road. That's much more interesting.
That's where we're going.
The roads were pretty sandy and dusty in this area, and so we let Tom take the lead in his open cab Jeep so that he wouldn't have to breathe our dust the whole trip. The trails weren't too challenging, but we found that the Jeep and the Sprinter van needed to take them at different speeds. The van did pretty well at about 20 miles an hour, and its suspension soaked up the sandy washboard bumps pretty well in this area. Tom's Jeep seemed better off taking them slower, so we often paused to let him get out ahead, and then we took the sandy sections with plenty of speed so we didn't get bogged down in this soft sand. You can hear a fair amount of squeaking in the audio recorded by the gimbal on the dashboard and as we're going down the road, and that seems to be mostly coming from the cabinets above the sink, at least near as I can figure. It's kind of hard to safely determine that while you're driving down a rough road to have someone in back listening, but I think that cabinet just needs some work as far as anchoring it more securely so it doesn't squeak. Our stock Sprinter suspension was actually kind of rough on the washboard and gravel roads, but on these sandy trails, these washboards were longer and slower essentially, and the suspension soaked them up pretty well. It was actually almost embarrassing how smooth the ride was over these sections. Do it like you mean it. Eventually things got wetter and less dusty, but there wasn't really any serious mud to contend with in this section. We stopped at some pretty spots along the way, and Tom managed to get in a little fly fishing. We hit some overgrown trails that needed a little trimming with the chainsaw in order to get the van through. And then we got to this section of logging road that had been recently used by some heavy trucks, and it left pretty deep ruts and a high center that tested our ground clearance. I think this might be the end of our road. Eventually we reached some logging operations, which were a little bit interesting to watch, but we couldn't go any further down this road, so we had to turn around. We had to drive back on pavement for a ways, and the tires were still aired down, so we kept it under 45 miles an hour. Eventually we reached Soldier Lake National Forest Campground, where we met up with the hikers again, and we all camped an extra day here to wait out some rainy weather. The next morning we headed out and found this very overgrown trail that supposedly led to a large lake. This was one of the tightest trails we took the van down. We scraped quite a bit, but there wasn't really anything that impeded our progress. It was clear that we were one of the biggest vehicles to come down this road in a long time. By this time, our friend Bill had joined us in his Ford pickup truck, so we had 3 vehicles total. You see we eventually made it through to the lake, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful spot. This would have been a great place to put in our inflatable kayak, but by the time we arrived to camp, we were pretty tired from driving, and we just relaxed around the campfire. We did get the drone up for some aerial footage of the lake, and it was pretty cool from the air. It's mostly weedy and shallow, and we think we spotted some moose way across the lake in the evening, but by that time it was too dark to get any video of them. Getting back out the next morning, it was more of the same tight trail. The trail's a little less tight now because we did a bit of pruning on our way. We picked up some rather large branches on the roof. No damage as far as we could see to the van, at least at this point. This is a great view of how the gap at the front of the awning collects branches, and I'm going to talk more about that later on. Yeah, we heard something kind of big.
We had some rain that night, so our last day of driving, we had quite a bit of more water over the trails. Tom decided to hike this day, and so this time it was just us and Bill in his pickup. We had aired the tires back up to cover a long section of blacktop, and decided not to air them down so that we wouldn't give up ground clearance.
Yeah, that's fun. It's deep. Don't go slowly.
On most of the trails, they were pretty smooth and it didn't make much difference, but we hit some rocky sections that kind of made us wish we'd aired the tires down again.
All right, we just had a major closet failure there.
Where's it going? Yeah. Like I guess.
Reaming the trail. Okay, there's the turnaround.
We found some big puddles that we decided we'd better probe with sticks before proceeding, just to make sure we weren't surprised by a deep mud hole. I can say from my own personal experience, it takes a lot less time to probe a dozen of these water holes like this than it takes to get unstuck out of a single deep one. Once we knew the water was shallow enough, we just drove through, trying to keep one set of wheels on solid ground whenever possible.
I can see the bottom of this one.
I've heard that.
Well, you can't say it's not an adventure van now.
On some sections, we did do a little trimming to give us a bit more clearance. Here I made a mistake of focusing on the trail, and I missed this stout branch hanging up over the trail, and I think this is where we sustained some damage on the roof that I'll show you later on.
Yeah, I didn't see that one.
Eventually we came to this large hump in the road, and I was pretty sure if we had enough speed the van would make it over, but I wasn't so sure about our low-hanging batteries and gray water tank that they'd still be attached on the other side. So we decided it would be prudent to turn back at this point rather than risk it. We headed back out to the paved roads and drove the rest of the way to Quamanon State Park to meet up with our hikers for the last night of our trip. Once we were back out on the pavement, the rest of the trip was pretty uneventful, and the van drove just fine, so no apparent damage to anything. So next up, I'll go over some of the parts of the van that worked out well for us, and I'll show you a few things that got damaged and some other things that I'd like to improve. I haven't washed the underside yet since we got back, and we didn't get any rain on the way back, so you can get some idea of how much mud accumulated on things. Here you can see the generator. It did collect a bit of mud, but generally worked okay. We did end up using it on one occasion, on one day, to recharge the battery when we just didn't have enough solar and when we hadn't been driving that day. So it was nice to have, and honestly it was very quiet compared to other generators in the campground where we stayed that night. I was a little worried about the exposed battery cables underneath, but they seemed to do just fine, so not a problem there. There was a little connector that's hanging down that I need to secure, but all in all I think the generator held up pretty well to the trails. Here you can see what happened to the trailer hitch connector that hangs down off the back of the bumper, and here's the connector that used to be positioned right about there. and really it was kind of the lowest thing on the back of the van. At some point on the trail, we hit bottom in this point, probably in a case where we were in ruts on both sides and had a high center in the middle. And I just need to purchase a new one of these connectors. They're not real cheap, so I'll probably fix it up here where it's protected by the hitch. In my last video, I showed that I had replaced the giant 3-inch gray water valve that came with the van with this much smaller 1.5-inch valve, and oriented it so that the handle points up rather than out and down, so there's far less of the valve that could be hit, and this worked out great. Really had no problems with it. We went over quite a lot of rough terrain and suffered no damage at all. Didn't even seem to catch a lot of debris, so very happy with that change to the van. My ham radio antenna guard worked great. We certainly threw a lot of branches at it, and the antenna was able to just flex out of the way without any damage to the base of the antenna that's behind this piece of black plastic. And it also did a good job of protecting this little vent because most of the branches were forced to ride up and over the plastic guard, so the vent didn't suffer any damage either. Here you can see that the Winegard signal booster did sustain some damage when a branch hit it. It cracked the housing, and I've already repaired it. It's ABS plastic, and I used some ABS solvent cement to glue it back together with a solvent weld, and then also added another layer of cement after that as additional waterproofing. And then I put a little chip of ABS kind of as a patch across the seam to help reinforce it. So I think it's well repaired, but clearly this needs some protection from being struck by branches. So that's one of the enhancements I'm going to be looking at next. The front of the awning was definitely a problem area. It seemed that every single branch that we contacted on the passenger side of the van rode up into this gap and kind of wedged itself here. And you can even see a little bit of damage where the piece was bent that holds the light strip, although the light strip still works. So that's definitely something we've got to fix. And this doesn't seem to be a problem unique to Thor campers. I've seen the same basic shape on a variety of different manufacturers where you have a curved van and a straight awning coming out, and unless there's something to fill in this gap and maybe deflect branches up and over it, it's just a spot where stuff is going to get wedged if you're driving on overgrown trails. So that'll be one of my upcoming projects, is to build a branch deflector for this area. We didn't actually use the light bar because we weren't driving trails at night, although it was nice to have it just in case something came up and we did need to do a nighttime drive. It took a lot of whacks from branches, on basically every branch that comes up over the van whacked the light bar and shows no damage. So it really stood up well. It did kind of tilt it a little bit as if the brackets in back weren't quite tight enough, but I'm going to work on some additional protection for this area so that the light bar doesn't take quite so much abuse next time. Well, I hope you enjoyed my trip report. We had a lot of fun on this trip. We're having a lot of fun with the van, and have a few more enhancements now to make and a couple of repairs, but it's going great, and we're really loving camping with it and look forward to the next trip. Thanks for watching.